Autumn 1944. The Third Reich is in a critical situation. The Red Army rolled through Army Group Center. The Wehrmacht rolled back to the west, leaving behind the smoking ruins of towns and villages. The Allies have liberated France and are standing on the borders of Germany itself. The war is lost, everyone understands this, except for one person in the Berlin bunker. And at this moment, when every soldier counts, when the Eastern Front is bursting at the seams and requires reinforcements, Adolf Hitler makes a decision that will go down in history as one of the most absurd military orders of the Second World War. He orders 400,000 German soldiers to remain in Courland, a narrow strip of the Latvian coast, cut off from the main forces, surrounded by the Red Army on all sides, without strategic importance, without hope of salvation. 7 months, 6 bloody offensives, hundreds of thousands of dead and wounded on both sides. For what? For the sake of a piece of land that could not change the outcome of the war. The Courland cauldron became a symbol of the Führer's maniacal stubbornness, a military absurdity, and a human tragedy on an unimaginable scale. Welcome to one of the most forgotten and at the same time the most violent episodes of the Second World War. Chapter 1. The Disaster of Army Group North. By September 1944, the military machine of the Third Reich was in a state of free fall. Operation Bagration, the Soviet summer offensive, literally wiped out Army Group Center, destroying 28 Wehrmacht divisions in 6 weeks. It was a disaster bigger than Stalingrad. The Red Army broke through Belarus to the Baltic Sea, cutting off German troops in the Baltic states from the main forces. Army Group North, stationed in Latvia and Estonia, was trapped. About 400,000 German soldiers, including elite SS divisions, were pinned to the coast. The logic of the military strategy was obvious: evacuate the troops by sea, transfer them to the defense of East Prussia and Germany itself, where every combat-ready soldier was worth his weight in gold. But Hitler thought differently. For him, the Baltic coast had an almost mystical significance. He was obsessed with the idea of holding the ports of Liepaja and Ventspils, ostensibly to protect submarine training areas and ensure the transportation of Swedish iron ore. In fact, by the fall of 1944, these arguments no longer made sense. The Kriegsmarine was defeated, the submarine war was lost, and Swedish supplies could be carried out through other routes. The real reason was simpler and scarier: Hitler could not accept the loss of territory. Every kilometer he gave away was perceived by him as a personal defeat, as a sign of weakness. The Führer lived in an alternate reality where a miracle weapon was about to turn the tide of the war, where the German war would be stronger than the enemy's material superiority. On October 10, 1944, an absurd order was issued to Army Group North, soon renamed Army Group Courland, to hold positions at all costs. Evacuation is prohibited. Retreat only to the fortified perimeter around the Courland Peninsula. This is how the Courland cauldron arose. Chapter 2. The First Battles for Courland. On October 15, 1944, the first Soviet offensive on the Courland Pocket broke out. The operation was commanded by Army General Ivan Kristoforovich Bagramian, one of the best Soviet commanders and the liberator of Belarus. His troops were tasked with destroying the encircled group and liberating Latvia. On paper, everything looked simple. The Germans were cut off, and their supply depended on naval convoys across the Baltic Sea, which was dominated by Soviet submarines and aircraft. The Red Army had overwhelming superiority in artillery and tanks. It seemed like a matter of weeks. The reality turned out to be cruel. The Germans turned Courland into one giant fortress. Every village, every woodland, every hill became a hub of defense. The minefield stretched for kilometers. Anti-tank ditches and pillboxes formed a multi-level system of fortifications. And most importantly, the defenders of the cauldron fought with the desperation of the doomed. The first offensive focused on the town of Dobele. The Soviet tank corps broke through the first line of defense, penetrated several kilometers, and immediately came under fierce counterattacks. German tank divisions, despite the shortage of fuel and equipment, struck at the flanks of the Soviet breakthroughs. The SS infantry fought fanaticism without taking a single step back. By the end of October, it became clear there will be no quick victory. The Red Army lost thousands of soldiers and hundreds of tanks, advancing only a few kilometers. The Germans were bleeding too. Each counterattack cost hundreds of lives, but the front line held on. Chapter 3. The Cauldron on Fire, the Second and Third Offensives. Autumn rains have turned Courland into a mess of mud and blood. The trenches filled with water, turning into ice trenches. There was not enough food, medicines were running out, and the wounded were evacuated last. Latvian villages were wiped off the face of the earth. Soviet artillery plowed through the ground, turning residential buildings into piles of bricks. The civilian population was caught between two fires. The German troops requisitioned the last food supplies. The Soviet troops treated the Latvians with suspicion, considering them accomplices of the occupiers. At the end of October, the Second Soviet Offensive began. This time, the main attack was carried out to the north, in the area of Tukums. Bagramian threw fresh infantry divisions into battle, reinforced by tank brigades. The artillery preparation lasted for several hours. The ground literally shook under the exploding shells. But even this offensive failed. German anti-tank guns mowed down dozens of Soviet tanks. The Wehrmacht infantry, entrenched in the forests, fought off attack after attack. By mid-November, the offensive had run out of steam, leaving the fields of Courland strewn with burnt-out tanks and thousands of corpses. The Soviet command began to realize the cruel truth: the destruction of the Courland Pocket by frontal attacks is too expensive. Every kilometer of progress was paid for by thousands of lives. Strategically, this piece of land was not worth such sacrifices. The main forces of the Red Army were needed for the offensive on Berlin. But Stalin thought otherwise. For him, Courland became a matter of prestige. He demanded that the encircled group be destroyed before the end of the war, and that the last German foothold on Soviet territory be wiped off the face of the earth. Preparations for the Third Offensive began immediately. On December 23, 1944, 2 days before Christmas, Soviet troops launched a new attack. The Third Battle of Courland was the bloodiest. There were battles for every house, for every high-rise. Entire regiments were destroyed in hand-to-hand combat. The German divisions, 61st and 205th, practically ceased to exist as combat units. By the new year of 1945, the front line had shifted by several kilometers. This is all that has been achieved at the cost of tens of thousands of lives on both sides. Courland turned into a giant meat grinder, where armies exhausted each other in a senseless positional war reminiscent of the worst days of the First World War. Chapter 4: Winter Hell, the Fourth and Fifth Battles. With the onset of 1945, the Courland Pocket plunged into a winter nightmare. Frosts reached -20 degrees, snow covered the trenches, frozen bodies lay between the front lines. It was impossible to bury them under constant fire. Soldiers of both armies built dugouts, lit bonfires from pieces of furniture, and shared their last cigarettes. Soviet loudspeakers broadcast propaganda in German: "The war is lost. Berlin will be taken. Surrender, and you will stay alive." Some ran over, exhausted, frostbitten, and hopeless. But most of them held on. The fear of Soviet captivity was stronger than the fear of death. They knew all too well what they were doing in the occupied territories. In mid-January, the Fourth Soviet Offensive began. Heavy snowfall limited the visibility and mobility of vehicles, but the attacks did not stop. Near the town of Prokule, Soviet tanks broke through the defenses and rushed deep into the German positions, only to be stopped by massive artillery fire. Burning T-34s illuminated the winter night. According to Soviet data, the Germans lost about 30,000 people killed and wounded in a month of fighting. The Red Army's own losses were no less. The front has advanced 3 to 4 kilometers. The loss-to-result ratio was catastrophic. In March, the Fifth Offensive followed, the last major attempt to break the defenses of the pocket before the end of the war. By this time, most of the Soviet troops had already been transferred to the west, to the Berlin direction. Secondary formations remained in Courland, whose task was to hold down the German forces. The Fifth Battle did not bring a breakthrough. The front line has not changed much. Soviet soldiers with bitter irony called Courland the Iron Coast, a fortress that could not be stormed. Chapter 5: The Last Days of the War, the Sixth Battle and the Surrender. April 1945. The final catastrophe was unfolding in Germany. The Red Army stormed Berlin, the Allies crossed the Rhine, and in a bunker under the Reich Chancellery, Hitler was preparing to commit suicide. And in Courland, 200,000 German soldiers were still on the defensive, still believing in the Führer's orders, still hoping for a miracle. There were rumors about the fall of Berlin. The officers were whispering about the news caught on captured radios. The soldiers understood that the end was near, but there was nowhere to retreat. The sea is behind us, the enemy is ahead. On May 8, 1945, Germany signed the Act of Unconditional Surrender. On the same day, the sixth and last battle for Courland began. The Soviet troops went on the attack, not knowing that the war was officially over. The Germans fought back, also unaware of the surrender. It was not until the evening of May 8 that General Karl Hilpert, commander of Army Group Courland, received a radio order to end the resistance. On May 9, he sent a message to Moscow about his readiness to surrender. On May 9, 1945, on Victory Day, almost 200,000 German soldiers laid down their arms. Columns of prisoners of war moved east to the camps, to Siberia, to face years of hard labor. Many will not live to return home. A special tragedy awaited the Latvians who fought on the German side. The Latvian SS Legion and local volunteers were traitors to the Soviet government. They were going to be shot or gulagged. The families were deported to Kazakhstan. Latvia finally became part of the USSR, and for half a century the memory of the Courland cauldron was erased from official history. The Courland cauldron imprisoned more than 500,000 Soviet soldiers within 7 months. These were the troops that could have accelerated the capture of Berlin, could have saved thousands of lives. Instead, they got stuck in the swamps and forests of Latvia, storming positions that were of no strategic importance. On the German side, the absurdity was even more obvious. 400,000 soldiers, cut off from their homeland, condemned to captivity, could defend East Prussia, could cover the evacuation of the civilian population. But Hitler kept them in Courland until the last day of the war, victims of his maniacal stubbornness. Courland was quickly forgotten in the West. History was overshadowed by the drama of the battle for Berlin, Okinawa, and Hiroshima. Even veterans rarely talked about it. This war after the war was too senseless, too cruel. Courland has become a taboo topic for Latvians. The Soviet government did not recognize any versions other than the official one, the heroic liberation, the defeat of the fascists. There is silence about the Latvians who fought on both sides, the destroyed villages, and the thousands of civilian victims. Today, the forests of western Latvia preserve memory. Rusty helmets pierced by bullets stick out of the ground. Boxes of ammunition, medallions with photographs, badges of soldiers are relics of that war. Sometimes the remains of German and Soviet soldiers are found lying a few meters apart, united by death. 10 years later, in 1955, the last prisoners of Courland returned home from the Soviet camps. Almost no one was waiting for them. Families have moved, wives have married others, children have grown up without fathers. Germany was rebuilding and preferred not to remember the lost war. Courland is a thing of the past, a forgotten, misplaced, uncomfortable memory of an avoidable disaster. Friends, subscribe to the channel and like it.